Let's start here, if we may. Oh, looks like Dave is awake. Let's go with Dave.
I'm just thoroughly fascinated with looking into the use of science and the scientific method to produce research that can be, we hope, a stable foundation for making decisions and, not just the patients, but the clinicians also choosing, among the available options, how do we move forward with as much certainty as we can have, given that there's no certainty. I want to point to one thing, point to two quick things, and then ask a question. First of all, on the slide about protecting people from risks that they're not aware of, right? There is Perry Cohen here today? Hi, Perry. He has had a couple of episodes of studies into Parkinson's treatments that were cut short or canceled, invalidated, whatever, because the people protecting the patients decided that it was all placebo effect and that was noise, and so the whole study should be thrown out. When to somebody with a declining disease, that whether their days are numbered, that they may want to not be protected so much. They may say, if there was a placebo effect, let's figure out what that is. All right, so I'd like to have that on the record. Regarding the blue button, the data format may be cheesy and little and so on, but trust me, as somebody who saw his own industry destroyed, typesetting, right, destroyed by desktop publishing, which started out as cheesy and meek, watch out, brother. There's a reason I'm wearing the blue button here, okay? And I get your point. But we might have a gentleman's bet of $100 to see where that is 5 years from now. Yes.
XML now. It's not text file. It's XML. So it's not a standard data format. It's raw.
So anyway, my question has to do. Some of you, I'm sure, are aware of the reproducibility initiative. And I was, in the several years I've been watching, trying to understand medicine, the only thing that has shocked me, except for the rate of medical errors, but the only thing in research was the discovery, the publication last year of the news that when Amgen tried to reproduce 53 landmark cancer studies, they failed to get the same result on 47 of them, tied to the news that most published studies are never replicated by another lab. And one of the first things I learned as a grade school science student is when 3 people do the same thing, they better get the same result. And so with this august panel, I wonder, for instance, if I were to just wave a wand right now without changing practice, I would add a wobble score to every published finding as to, saying whether anybody else has ever gotten the same result. Because what we do is we take the results and then put them on patients, hoping we'll get the same result. So thanks. Thoughts on that, on reproducibility? Is it important?
Ken, do you want to take a stab at that?
It's extremely important, and there are some important approaches that are being taken to trying to regularize our approach to understanding all the research that's been done. For example, as you're probably familiar, clinicaltrials.gov and the trial registration process has been shown to give insight into what was always suspected, but has now been very well demonstrated, that there's a publication bias. So studies that are positive are published, studies that are negative are not published. The negative studies used to be dark matter. We never could see them. We could only infer them. Now we can begin to see them as well. And so yes, reproducibility is important. It turns out that which organization and type of organization is funding the study is somewhat predictive about whether the results will be positive or not, industry versus academia versus other not-for-profits. So this area of understanding the evidence, whether the evidence is real, so that there's the fundamental assumption that there's evidence-based medicine, is potentially flawed, and that's what's so interesting about the learning health system. It's a completely new way to produce evidence, and one which has its own set of methodological challenges, but that I think are fascinating and very promising.
Just one closing note on this. To me, this is absolutely not just a matter of patients' rights, although obviously patients are the ones who are physically at stake. But it's a disservice to the clinicians who've been trained to use evidence, for heaven's sake. And I would hope that somebody would, I will propose a practice that the funders of research, that just become an ethical imperative, that they, for instance, I think the Reproducibility Initiative in Palo Alto is proposing something like a 10 or 15% additional charge to have a second lab try to reproduce the result. Thanks.
Thanks. Let's go here. And if I could ask the questioners to try to be as concise as possible so we can hear from everybody who's standing right now, that would be great. Thank you.
I'm Türkan Gardenier from Pragmatica Corporation. Notes of commendation for both Drs. Mandel and Dr. Margolis. And by the way, I had heard of Dr. Margolis' name in the statistical literature before now. My question relates to the exponential increase of data in these large databases, which are being called big data now. But also, the question is, do they ever get decreased? For example, in industrial engineering, in inventory control, there's a LIFO, FIFO system, where once you converge upon a consensus of opinion, maybe you don't need the old data anymore. And relative to replicability, there's a lot of literature on meta-analyses, for example. Once studies converge upon a agreed consensus, maybe you don't need any more data of that kind. Do you run into questions like that? The idea of patients like me, for example, is very interesting because you can do clusters of individuals that will benefit from certain therapies. Are those ideas getting integrated into the increasing results and conclusions that are generated out of the interactive features of the wonderful databases?
I could speak to biobanking, because in that setting, in genomic research, federated databases would be envisioned as an ongoing resource because you can ask many different questions against the same data set. So there is no plan to retire any of those data. And I don't know if you wanted to add anything more to that. But
I think in terms of the data management, I don't think there are any good plans along the ways that you're proposing, which is very interesting. But a slightly orthogonal issue is just that we do sometimes perhaps try to get data across every place and every setting, when in fact a subset of those data would be fine. And it's been demonstrated again and again that these findings are fractal in the sense that you can see them in every place you look. So it may be that certain associations between drugs and adverse events, for example, we've been able to demonstrate in a single health system with statistical significance in a way that's reproducible. So some work can be done much less expensively and with smaller big data and sooner, because you can do these studies within even a single health system or a couple of health systems. So it's a very important question.
Victor Montori, Mayo Clinic. First, congratulations to the great panel. I have a couple of things. One is to the point that Dave brought up. I want to make people aware of the alltrials.net initiative. That is a worldwide petition to have all clinical trials published in full. So it's one more initiative to try to get the evidence record to be complete for all the reasons that Dave pointed out. It's important. The second thing is a question for Dr. Cass. I actually brought your papers with me to review it. And one of the things that I think is striking about this new framework is that it does require a lot less mental gymnastics to try to figure out what it is that you're doing vis-a-vis the IRB. And I suspect the IRBs are going to take a long time to come around. But maybe if patients and clinicians and engaged in health services research were to advocate for it, we may see some interesting experiments. But one thing you said struck me as something that may need empirical evidence, which is beyond the many anecdotes, what is the evidence for opportunity cost of the ethical regulation we have now in relation to research that has not taken place because of it? You said there was a lot of work that probably has not taken place because of regulatory and ethical burdens. What is the empirical evidence of that? And then my last point is, all of you, I think, maybe I heard what I wanted to hear, made a big case for generosity. In many different ways, you all spoke about, data fluidity and other things, but based on people volunteering, generously interconnecting. I think generosity was, maybe I heard it, or maybe I imagined it, but I think it was at the base of this. But some of the concerns about big data are not really is that this big data is not getting into the hands of people that are being driven by generosity and altruism and trying to do good as their primary mission. There's a big industry evolving now around big data where the primary mission is not altruism. It could be a secondary side effect of it. And there's some interesting stories around that, including the notion of medical records or medical information being combined with credit rating. Things like that, which the patient individuals have not given the credit rating agencies any authorization, really, we thought, to combine that with your medical information, and some of the data is not being authorized to be combined with the but because these corporations can do it, they're doing it, and the oversight is minimal. I want some comments on that.
So great question, and I don't know of good quantitative empirical evidence. There are two things I want to say, though, because it's such an important question, that speak to the kinds of empirical evidence that would be helpful. So there is what I will call growing amount of anecdotes, some of which are published. We've done now 4 focus groups with quality improvement and comparative effectiveness researchers who speak to the times when they did not embark on a project. So I think there's one category which is of people who thought about doing a project and abandoned the idea. And that's one kind of opportunity cost, and one can think about how to collect more data. The other kind of opportunity cost is where where you don't even capture, I started an idea and then it was too much of a hassle to go through the IRB, but it's really more the number of clinical contexts where, I'll sort of make something up, where when you go to the doctor today, they give you the same 2 options that you would have been given 10 years ago, the identical 2 options, and there's really no more data that anybody brings to that discussion than they did 10 years ago. And that's a really different kind of opportunity cost that we don't think about as concretely, but is probably more profound. And it is a very different way to reveal what we've lost by not doing the constant learning.
My name's John Gardenier. I'm retired after a career of scientific research using quantitative methods. Now consider myself a quantitative ethicist. As a patient diagnosed with prostate cancer, I found that there seems to be no medical science. There's a lot of medical practice, but no science related to this. I thought, because I'm a very experienced researcher and I understand math and statistics and like that, I could go into the internet, I could talk to doctors, and I could really find out what is the best thing to do with my cancer. I found out it's absolutely untrue. The best site was the Prostate Cancer Association, listed all the different kinds of treatment and said they all work, but they all have risks. That was not terribly helpful. So I went to 7 different physicians, with various kinds of radiation oncology, various kinds of surgery, this and the other, and every one of them knew exactly what I should do, and they were all different. again, where is the science there? Ultimately, I decided on cryoablation because at least it wouldn't do any damage to my organs or create a new cancer risk. But ultimately, it didn't work. I had to back it up with external beam radiation, and finally, I got cancer-free. All right. Talking to doctors didn't help. Talking to patients doesn't help because the vast majority of people treated for prostate cancer get better no matter what treatment they're given. It's a very successful practice, but I can't find out by talking to patients what the relative risk is. And so I would suggest a possibility that either we design studies where there are alternative treatments that attempt to get in a quantitative manner at the relative risks of and relative benefits of different types of treatments. Or if we're not able to do that, please just say, I don't know, or we don't know.
Hi, I also want to thank the panel for what I thought was just a brilliant series of discussions. My comments really mostly are for Nancy, which I thought was a brilliant framing of an issue. My name's Jonathan Dare. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer for the Geisinger Health System. And innovation is this space frequently where you are implementing new things, not necessarily new drug therapies, but new modes of the delivery of care. And if I want to evaluate that kind of work, it gets very complicated very quickly. So I'm permitted to do uncontrolled experiments all the time with no notion of whether they actually improve care. So that's just, it's a very common thing. And innovation, I think, is this term that's picking up. And nobody really is quite sure where it sits in this world of evaluation. My comment is really about this culture issues, both from a funding perspective as well as a researcher perspective. I've run into a lot of resistance to this notion of from people who consider themselves to be more pure researchers to actually improving the quality of care for patients. That if they felt like it had a real patient at the end of it, they weren't interested. It was not their purview. And we even had this notion of this unsafe quality improvement activity, and they're like, well, I don't care about that. I just want to know if it's research or not. So I wanted to get your comments from the panel. Is this something that other folks have been seeing, and what's the roadmap towards really bringing this culture, the cultural change, which I think needs to happen in order for us to be able to evaluate much more thoughtfully this kind of new world of this combined quality improvement and translational research. Thanks.
This is something that we think a lot about, and from a system perspective, we call it playing the whole game. So what we talk about at Cincinnati Children's is the entire trajectory from what happens in the lab to what gets applied to patients. It's a matter of leadership to make it a priority that we're all aimed at the same thing, which is better outcomes for patients. What we found is that when we, as leaders, work in that way, it's not perfect, but there is much more alignment between the people who consider themselves researchers, the people who consider themselves quality improvement people, and the people who consider themselves doctors or patients about what they're doing and how important it is for their work to fit together. And what it produces, we think, is what we call a derived research agenda, in which the issues that patients and clinicians care about are being brought systematically to the researchers and the quality improvement people to inform the kinds of work that they do.
Hi, I'm Dave Clifford. I work with patients like me. One of the questions that came to mind when Dr. Cass and Alice Leiter were speaking earlier in the panel was, whose ethics? So we talk about ethical review, but we don't talk about the ethics of who. So if you go to one IRB and you go to another IRB and you go to a third IRB, you've got different senses of ethics that are leading them to determine why should things be done. And I'm wondering if you could comment on sort of collective standards for ethics, especially now that we're looking more at research processes with the patient involved directly with them, or commenting or advising to those panels. So for example, if I were to have a PCORI grant, and it were to be a substantial grant, and I had 5 people that were patients designing that study, or in the case of Peter's work, an institution might override my ability to do that study, even if the patients thought there were robust and sufficient protections. So I'm just wondering if you could speak a little to those balances.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, so there's tons of evidence that IRBs make decisions differently, and that has led some people to say, so why do we do this review at all? I mean, is the whole thing sort of bogus? But with the other example, we still go to doctors and they give us 7 different recommendations too. So you can say, okay, that's good or bad, but I think ethical norms really do shift. And I actually think that even under our current regulatory, so there are several of us who think that maybe it's time for a culture shift that would actually result in some changes to the regulatory language. But even short of that, I think that there are a lot of different ways to interpret something like, what does it mean to be respectful to a patient? And I think historically what that meant was you have to tell a patient everything, you need to get a written signature, and you need to be extremely protective. And that led to a bunch of decisions that resulted in a lot less learning. And there is right now a growing recognition, but I honestly think that it is in part through people hearing more stories like were said this morning. And I can't underscore that enough. That lead people to say, I am a firm believer that people have been trying to do what they thought was the right thing. And people start to gain some recognition that maybe the way to be most respectful to patients is to listen to what they're clamoring for, and figure out new models to make sure that they're not exploited and harmed and given bad treatments as far as people can best assess, while honoring what it is that they're trying to get progress around.
Thanks for that. And Cassie, if you can be as quick as you can, please.
I'll be
Thanks.
very quick. You just basically addressed what I was going to say, is that please remember in your research that it all comes down to one patient at a time, and that the numbers and the data are individual people, and generally suffering people. We have a new organization in Maine that's going to collect a healthy amount of data from all payers. Health InfoNet, I think is what it's called, and I think today or tomorrow they'll be presenting to the Maine Department of Health and Human Services their project. But the concern I had is the opt-in, opt-out for patients. And as a nurse that sat at a triage desk for years and had people sign consents for treatment and consents to release information to insurance companies, the opt-out approach is just against my grain. Could somebody comment on that? It seems that we need to consent for, not consent against. I don't know how else to put that. It just seems that's a concern for me. Thank you.
If we can, I think that one of our talks in the next panel actually is going to come very close to exactly what you're asking about. So if we could maybe address that when we get there. And if yours is real quick, and I have to ask nobody else to stand up at this point because we're running behind. No. And I do want to make sure that we do fair by the next panel. So real quick.
I'll be very quick. Mark Gorman, and patient advocate. The last exchange here with Nancy, I had in the IRBs and stuff prompted me. There is a stakeholder who's lurking in the background of this whole panel who must be brought into the conversation, and that's the legal departments of the institutions and their colleagues, because I'm really convinced, and I'm trained as a lawyer, that a lot of the variability on a lot of these issues is driven by lawyers who are doing what they're trained to do. And if they don't have the context of what patients and clinicians are actually trying to do, a lot of these problems are never going to go away.